Hello, I'm Maria Hall Brown, and this is LA Currents. Over 60 years of tackling tough issues and transforming lives. My guest today has witnessed it for over 25 years. I'm delighted to be joined by the Executive Director of ThePeopleConcern, John Maceri. Lovely to have you here.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
That is a legacy of an organization in Los Angeles, working on some, how did ThePeopleConcern, which wasn't its original name, how did it actually come into being?
Well, ThePeopleConcern was actually formed 7 years ago, 7 years next month, as a matter of fact, in the merger between what was the Ocean Park Community Center, OPCC, based in Santa Monica, and Lamp Community, based downtown in Skid Row. So this year, actually, the combined organization, we're celebrating the 60th anniversary of what was the Ocean Park Community Center. So we've been doing this work a very long time, and what a lot of people don't know is that Molly Lowry, the woman who founded Lamp Community, actually was the director at OPCC from 1976 to 84 wow. before she left to go downtown and start Lamp Community in Skid Row. So we have this very long legacy of the two organizations, have this shared history, which is exciting.
But you've been around since '96.
I've been at the organization since 1999.
99,
actually.
Okay.
Yeah. So.
And you've seen a lot.
Yes. Yeah. It's the work has certainly changed. I mean, we've seen, of course, the increase in street homelessness. We've seen the rise in the opioid epidemic, fentanyl. Now the challenges for the level of trauma of the people that we're serving has certainly increased over the years. When I first came to the agency, we would see typically people, if they were substance addicted, it was primarily alcohol, sometimes marijuana, occasionally heroin or cocaine. But we've seen a pretty dramatic shift, especially in the last 10 years, with a rise in opioid addiction.
Oh.
The people that we serve have always experienced a lot of cumulative trauma in their lives. I mean, that's true for anybody who's been outdoors. And of course, one of the major drivers into homelessness for women and children is domestic violence. So that piece of it really isn't new. I think what we've seen happen over time is that we're seeing people with much more serious mental illness. We're seeing people with much more chronic health conditions. We're seeing people who have been outdoors for a longer period of time, and we're seeing people experiencing homelessness aging. Just as the general population is aging, the people on the streets are aging as well. So the combination of all of those things, I think, brings particular challenges to the work.
I don't know whether you can actually answer this question, but something you just said, you're seeing more mental illness. Is the mental illness drug related, or is the mental illness chemical imbalance in a person in general that has not been treated?
Well, generally, and we're speaking in broad generalities anytime we talk about any group of people, mental illness is usually a chemical imbalance in the brain. So that said, we know that a lot of people with mental illness also self-medicate. So you said earlier, people will use drugs or alcohol, and the proliferation of very highly addictive and cheap street drugs is available to folks on the street. And so if someone is experiencing schizophrenia, for instance, may use drugs or alcohol to modify their symptoms. The challenge is that when people sober up, the symptoms come back, and they usually come back with a vengeance. And so it becomes this sort of vicious cycle, as it were. And sometimes when we're working with people, it's not uncommon that they have co-occurring disorders, and sometimes it's difficult to know which came first, the mental illness or the substance addiction, because they're so intertwined.
Okay, so the homeless count was just released as of when we're chatting right now. What has it told you? What have you seen from what the services you provide perspective?
Yeah, I mean, what it tells me is that we have a lot more work to do. That we see that the numbers are still extraordinarily high, both in the city and the county of Los Angeles. We also see that homelessness is an issue that responds to strategic and wise investments in resources. And what do I mean by that? We've had a deficit of affordable housing for decades. It's that is a significant driver for people who cannot afford housing in Los Angeles. It's certainly a driver for people falling into homelessness, because the rents are increasing, wages are not keeping pace with the increase in rent. So that's a significant issue. In terms of the numbers of unsheltered people living on the streets, we know that relentless engagement, moving people indoors. The mayor's Inside Safe initiative is a good example of really accelerating moving people indoors and then connecting them to permanent housing with wraparound services. So it's not just moving people into housing, it's housing retention, and I would argue, in our view, housing retention is really as important, probably more important than just housing people, because if people are moved indoors and they fall out of housing, we haven't done them any great favors. So those are sort of the four components, and I think what the numbers tell us is we need to double down on the things we know work, which is what I've described: relentless street engagement, some kind of temporary housing, or people are ready and units are available to move them into permanent housing as quickly as possible, and then wrap services around them so that they remain housed.
Is it a ping pong? Are we seeing people go in for a few months and then they're back out in a couple months and back out in a couple months and back out?
Well, I think it depends on sort of which program you're looking at,
okay.
right? So I would say as a system generally, and I always think of things from a systems perspective, because anecdotally we know that individuals experience moving in and out of temporary interventions. Overall, though, what we want to do is build a robust system where there's flow through. So in other words, when people move into interim, whatever temporary housing that is, whether it's a motel, whether it's a congregate facility, a tiny home village, whatever the temporary intervention is, what we need to do is make sure from a systems perspective that we're building an exit strategy on the back end so that there is a match for those individuals going into permanent housing. So if you look at what Inside Safe has done in matching those individuals in motels with a permanent housing placement, that's the way that you create throughput in the system, which is really important. And I think one of the things that we need to pay more attention to, and certainly the mayor has in her directives to streamline the production of new housing to create more housing units. And that's not just building new units. We could do master leasing. There's more that we could be doing now to capture permanent units so that we can move people faster. I would say that is my primary criticism of our current system, is that we don't we spend a lot of time focusing on sort of the temporary intervention, which is fine because we want to eliminate human suffering as quickly as possible, but we also at the same time, so it's not either or, either you do this or you do that, it's and both. We need to find be building the capacity on the back end to be able to house people permanently.
Along those lines, a lot of things were already in place, and I've had this conversation before, so this is not something tragically new, but there were hospitals that took care of people who were unable to take care of themselves, that had mental illness to the point in which they needed support. There were Section 8 vouchers. There were all these things that were in place that now you can't get a voucher. And you put yourself on a list to hopefully get a voucher, and then if you get a voucher, then to hopefully maybe find a complex that'll take it. That's multiple years and years and years, and there are no hospitals. And then, so to your point about what are we doing on the back end of all of this, the temporary housing? I mean, the governor is giving LA more tiny houses. Lots of conversations about building all these safe environments, but what is happening on the back end to, if not recover what had been lost, but make something happen in a fashion that's rapid enough to literally at least not stop the tide, stem it somewhat?
Yeah, and I think you've identified a critical issue, and again, when we talk about systems capacity and developing, is that I think there are a few things that we could improve upon. One is finding ways to create more permanent housing stock that doesn't just rely on building from the ground up. We need to do that. It's important to do that because those units, have long-term, usually 55-year covenants attached to them, which means that they are deed restricted. And they will be there in perpetuity. And that's really important because, as I said earlier, we have a significant deficit of affordable units in Los Angeles. So we need to keep doing that. That's important. I think sometimes in the policy conversations, we get into this either or. Either we do this or we do that. And our advocacy is you need to do both. You need to do all of those things because you want to lift the capacity of the entire system. So we need to look at other ways to develop permanent housing faster. How do we do that? We do that through master leasing, for instance. There's been a lot of conversation about master leasing on motels for temporary and interim interventions, which is fine, but we also need to look at there is, even in a tight and expensive real estate market like Los Angeles, we do have private landlords and developers who are willing to make units available. They are currently available, or they could be, they would buy properties and rehabilitate them using their own dollars. It's substantially less per unit to bring online if we could get a master lease guarantee on the back end, which essentially means that those rental subsidies would be used to pay for those units and then reserve them for people experiencing homelessness, that we could move into housing much faster. All of those things together will bring more permanent units. To the issue that you raised about, the mental health hospitals, we, made a decision, in my opinion, one of the worst public policy decisions ever perpetuated on the American public is that, we were sold a bill of goods that we were going to shut down mental institutions and we were going to build a robust community mental health system. Now that's based on the premise that most people living with mental illness, most people do very well in community-based settings. When they have adequate housing and they have adequate supports, they actually thrive. But what we did is we took away the infrastructure on the hospitals with the promise of building the infrastructure in community-based settings. We never did the second part. And so today, our streets have become open-air asylums. And so we reaped what we've sown from a policy perspective. That is harder to unwind now because we're not replacing those institutions. What we should be doing, though, is investing significantly in a community mental health system, in a robust system that provides easy access to care and treatment to people in real time. If we do that, then we will begin to see the reductions, of people living on the streets because they are shut out of care and don't have access. So if we do all of those things, we'll begin to see the impact in terms of street homelessness.
So one of the critical questions to ask you, because the ThePeopleConcern have one-on-one relationships with those that are unhoused or suffering from domestic violence, etc. But there is also the issue of what are they willing to do, because I know one of the issues that we hear, and outsider looking in, that there are too many rules and those that are unhoused and have a particular mindset don't want to follow said rules to get into whatever services are being provided at the current time.
Yeah.
What are you seeing and hearing?
It's interesting, Ray. I've been doing this work a very long time.
Yeah.
And I have worked with thousands and thousands of homeless people. So, one of the kind of common narratives is that people on the streets don't want housing. They don't want to come indoors. And that simply isn't true. I have never heard the story of someone saying, I had a great life. I had a house, I had a job, I had money, I had family and friends, and one day I just woke up and decided to throw that all away and go live on the street. I have never heard that story. I have often heard the story of I had a great life, I had a house, I had a job, I had money, I had family, and then this happened, and then that happened. And it's often a downward spiral in people's lives. Our experience has been that people lose hope. They really begin to believe, especially if they're lost in the fog of mental illness or addiction, they really begin to believe that their life is never going to be any different. And so, part of the work is building a trusting relationship with people to help them understand that there really is a different path. Now, of course, at the end of the day, we don't fix, rescue, or change people. People fix, rescue, and change themselves. Our job is to be able to provide them the tools and resources and support they need in order to make informed choices about their lives. And what you see over and over again, and there's plenty of research out there about this, when you give people what they want in real time, not make promises, not say we're going to put you on a list where you're going to wait for years and years, because quite frankly, what is the incentive then? So then we begin to blame the person and say, well, you just don't want help. Well, yes, I want help, but if I'm going to wait 3 or 5 years on a waiting list to get into housing, what incentive is there for me, to change my life? Going back to my earlier point that people lose hope. So I really think we need to shift our thinking based on experience and data, frankly, rather than anecdote. Yes, I know it's very, very common that someone goes out and encounters a person who's actively using and says, yeah, I don't want to go inside because I don't want to stop using. And so we just assume that person and every person like them doesn't want to come indoors. That just simply isn't true.
So anecdotally, I am going to reference something that I had read in an article directly related to getting to know someone and what you really have to get into when dealing with someone who is suffering. And that was, one of your caseworkers worked with a client who had failed the vulnerability survey multiple times over. And it wasn't until they had a trusting relationship with a case manager that they were willing to really expose their struggles and their problems, and therefore, sadly, but happily ended up higher on the list that got them into safe and secure housing and ultimately into permanent housing. And now they're, willing to share that tale.
Yeah.
How important is that, taking that time, and are your case managers and caseworkers taught something very specific, or do you seek that type of human out that will have that relationship with the people they're working with?
It's extremely important. The greatest tool we have is the ability to build a trusting relationship, because once you have that, it is much easier. Nothing is easy. This work under the best of circumstances is extremely difficult. And my hat goes off not just to our staff, but all direct service staff that are on the front lines every day, literally in the streets and in the freeway overpasses, engaging with people. But you raise, I think, the most important issue in this work. Foundational is really building that trust and also being skilled enough to understand. So what you're referencing is the VI SPIDAT score, which is an assessment tool that's used to determine someone's acuity. And the higher the acuity, the higher up on the list you go for access to being matched to housing. Now, in a perfect world, if we had adequate housing resources, that wouldn't be as much of an issue. But with limited resources, it's a triage tool that's really used to identify people who are the most vulnerable, to be able to move them indoors, because those are the people that are most likely literally to die on the streets without an intervention. The challenge with that is what you just described, is the quality of the tool is only as good as the information that's being provided, which, that means that the individual being assessed has to be a good self-reporter, and we know often that isn't the case. I like to say that the only time in my life I've ever heard anybody say, "Hi, I'm John and I'm an alcoholic," is in an AA meeting. That's not usually the way people present or they lead, saying, "Hi, I'm John, I'm substance addicted. Hi, I'm John, I have a mental illness." Especially when you're just meeting people, that's not, the information they're going to provide. As you build trust and as you build a relationship with people, you begin to get more information, both in terms of self-reporting, but also, frankly, a skilled interviewer understands, how to be able to, what we call motivational interviewing, to draw that information out, not in an intrusive way, but really to be empathetic and to understand, what the challenges are. So it's really important. We have a combination on our outreach teams are all multidisciplinary. So we have licensed mental health clinicians paired with people with lived experience. When you put those, and as well as medical professionals and substance abuse specialists. So you have that combination of the skills and expertise of people who have both been in the situation of the people that we're serving and people who have advanced clinical training to be able to identify signs or symptoms. And this is not about pathologizing people. It's really about being able to help people. We have psychiatrists that are available, so if people need and want medication, we can do that. We do that on the streets. So there's all kinds of ways that we bring those resources to bear to provide a holistic approach to care. And when you do that, what you find is that the people that we're serving over time will respond in really positive ways. So that example you described is a great example of you need expertise to be able to use a tool that is a very good thing in trying to assess someone, but if it's not accurately applied, then it's not as useful and impactful as it could be.
I should get down to brass tacks. You have outreach teams, you have facilities. I mean, how many people do you touch? How many lives do you touch a year? And how many teams do you have? Just kind of a general overview.
Yeah, so
it's very complicated.
Yeah, so right now, ThePeopleConcern, we're fielding 18 multidisciplinary street outreach teams on the west side, in downtown, in Skid Row, and in the Hollywood, East Hollywood area. And they are, as I described, they have medical professionals, mental health clinicians, substance abuse specialists, and then people with lived experience. We call those peer specialists. We operate 700 beds of interim housing throughout Los Angeles County. We're supporting over 3,000 units of permanent supportive housing. That's about almost 3,800 people in permanent supportive housing, and then wraparound services, so mental health care, primary care, substance use, and domestic violence services. Because as I said, for us, keeping people housed, and we have a 92% retention rate in our housing. So that means 92% of the people that we house are never homeless again, and the other 8%, the vast majority of those people are passing away in their units. So I'm very proud of that. And it's important, for, I think, all of us to realize is that this work is a marathon, not a sprint. So we look at housing retention rates over a 10-year arc. And so, that for us is kind of the essence of the work, building a trusting relationship, helping people figure out what they want and what they need and what we can provide to them, in real time.
So we've spoken a lot about the unhoused, but one of the critical areas that you do really support, obviously, is domestic violence. And you've had this perspective now since 1999.
Yeah.
How is that? Is it escalating? Is it something that frightens you, or do you feel like there are support systems out there that are helping that scenario? I mean, where are we in that tragic arena?
Well, I think there's, with domestic violence, there's always good news and bad news. I mean, the bad news is that domestic violence is alive and well, sadly. And it's been part of our organization. We actually operate the second oldest domestic violence program in the state of California, so it's been in continual operation. Sojourn is our DV program for 46 years this year. When we started, the program, the shelter, actually started with a group of volunteers who ran our drop-in center. And in the morning, they would notice, this was in Santa Monica, they would notice in the morning there would often be women who would come to the center. They'd be in their cars. Sometimes they had children, sometimes not. They weren't women who were homeless. These were housed women, in many cases, upper middle class women. And as the volunteers began to talk with the women, they found out that they were victims of domestic violence. So in those days, now this is back in the 1970s, they would leave their house, wait for the batterer to go to work, and just needed a place to be away. But there were no shelters, there were no crisis shelters. So it was just, they came to the center because it was a safe space and they knew that they could talk to somebody. And that was really the genesis of the battered women's movement. Of course, the 70s, the women's movement generally, and then as, domestic violence came to the forefront. I mean, domestic violence has been happening for millennia, sadly, but it really wasn't recognized, as a significant problem, societal problem, until 50 years ago or so. Fast forward to today, what do we see, the shifts? It is, as I said earlier, it is the major driver into homelessness for women and children. That continues, sadly, to this day. What we see in the people that we serve is that the majority of the women that we serve have been victims of physical or sexual assault, as either as a result of becoming homeless or often before they became homeless, and it drove them into homelessness, and then that continued. And so the good news, I would say, certainly in the last couple of years, the work that the Downtown Women's Center has done in collaboration, with local domestic violence providers, ourselves included, is really beginning to recognize the interconnectedness. And again, this is not new information, but there's been a shift in service delivery to understand and sort of retool the way the homeless service system responds to victims of domestic violence. It used to be that if you had experienced domestic violence and you were homeless, you would sort of get shoved off to the DV system without a recognition that these things are all interrelated, and that actually I think the homeless service delivery system is done a much better job over the last 5 or 6 years in sort of recognizing the interconnectedness, training staff in homeless service agencies to recognize DV, to be able to connect survivors to services more quickly, understand the trauma that comes from women experiencing DV. So I think the bright spot, is that the system itself is responding in a different way that it has in the past, and that's a really good thing.
I have so many things to ask you, and I'm so running out of time. But what I do want to ask is that, money is getting poured into this, and a lot of money has been spent on this entire tragedy. Money is just a tool. Right. Money is not a solution.
Right.
But are you feeling that it's going to help and that things will, in fact, get better? Are you an optimistic person at this moment in time?
I am an optimist. I don't think you can do this work and not be optimistic. And I think it is true that, to address any issue or challenge in society, it takes resources, And I think what we've seen is, and I said this earlier, that homelessness responds to strategic, wise investments. What are those things? We've talked a lot about them, and thank you very much for having me on the program today, because I think it's important for anybody who's watching to understand that homelessness is not an intractable, unsolvable problem. That simply isn't true. We know exactly what to do. What we need is the resources, and we kind of need all the barriers to get out of the way and let us get the job done. So by investing, in permanent housing, that is scalable and replicable is going to be really important to continue the important work of relentless engagement and street outreach, to create those bridges for people, in between, and, to really invest in care and treatment, both on the mental health and substance use side. So we're starting to see, that come to the forefront more and be connected in ways that it hasn't before. I think if we can do all of those things and not get into this sort of circular, argument about you can only do this or you can only do that. No, we have to do all of it. And I think also driven by good public policy. We've seen, I said earlier, we've reaped what we've sown on the mental health side, not to make those kinds of mistakes, going forward. I think if we can do all of those things, and we have elected officials and policymakers who will really listen to the people doing the work and to the people who are receiving the services, we have a chance, we have an opportunity to make a significant dent.
If people want to learn about the People Concern, get involved, find out how they can help, what's the easiest, best way? Yeah,
the easiest way is to go to our website, which is www.ThePeopleConcern.org, and there's a whole list of ways to get involved, volunteer opportunities. We love volunteers. Certainly financial contributions are welcome, and advocacy as well. So there's lots of ways to plug in.
All right. Well, John, it's been wonderful talking to you, and I look forward to having you back so we can learn how much more wonderful things you are doing.
Thank you. It's really been a pleasure.
And that's a wrap on this LA Currents.